Yeah, it needs to become a reputational risk for a big emitter, a big company, not to be offsetting. Whereas currently, I think you talk to the sustainability department and they're like, well, it's a real risk to go and buy red credits. Like we can just do nothing and we're fine. If we start buying these credits, so we're going to put ourselves into potential getting on the front page of a paper. We just don't want to go that. So I guess space intelligence comes in a bit here. We try to offer data sets to convince companies, at least internally and externally, that they're only buying credits from high quality projects. Yeah, certainly the REDD projects we supported previously, they're not ones that have been caught up in this, in that they've been caught up in the wider storm, but they didn't overissue credits. That's good. But I don't know if we can persuade enough corporates to take that jump now. As you say, if they start doing it in 2031, we'll have lost another big chunk of rainforest, have a hotter atmosphere and harder world to grow trees in, all this kind of thing. That the action needs to happen ideally 20 years ago. We'll take it this year if we can. But yeah, we can't delay this by more years.
Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. I'm your host, Eddie Smith, here with my co-host, Rene Velasquez. Today, we're joined by Ed Mitchard, co-founder and chief scientist of Space Intelligence, a company that's become essential infrastructure for high-integrity carbon projects. Ed, thank you for joining us today. It's great to have you on.
Pleasure to be here. I enjoy listening to this on my run in the morning, so it's great to be part of it.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think to start, it would be great to have you walk us through your journey. I think you have a unique journey, from winning a documentary competition as a teenager that took you to the Amazon, to then working in the carbon markets, to now leading space intelligence. We would love to hear that story.
Well, I'm going to have to tell that story now. Yeah, I guess I've always been interested in kind of forests and how they interact with nature. I remember going on long walks through English countryside back as a young child with my granddad in particular. Yeah, I guess I must have been interested in this kind of thing because I applied for a nationwide competition when I was 15 to go and film for a Japanese TV company in Brazil. It's a bit of a random one. It was a series called Super Teachers led by Sir Ian Prance, who used to be head of Kew Gardens, was for a long time an expert in biodiversity in Brazil. Anyway, we spent a week filming on a boat in the Amazon around Manaus. It's absolutely incredible seeing all the biodiversity. Fantastic opportunity for 6 school kids. But it was quite interesting because they tried to keep us away from deforestation and that kind of side of things that were happening. But it was incredibly obvious. You could see the fires going on, people clearing land and burning, even right up inside. We went to this pristine national park and you could see right up against the edge of the national park, there was this destruction, this fragmentation of the Amazon rainforest. Yeah, became determined that this would be part of my career. It seemed absolutely crazy that we were continuing to deforest the world's kind of store of carbon and biodiversity at the rate we were. I wanted to do something about that. I went on and studied biology at university at Oxford, got involved in lots of different conservation efforts while I was there, including leading an expedition to Trinidad, where we went to study the biodiversity in tree canopies there. It's quite cool. Got to learn how to climb up trees and collect orchids and bromeliads from up the trees. We chose Trinidad because no one had ever looked at the epiphytes, these plants that grows on trees. But also we could see that 90% of forest in Trinidad had been lost already, suffered enormous deforestation, kind of similar kind of rates to the UK. And you wanted to go and look and see what was left. But while I was doing that, it was really hard to find maps back then, the mid-2000s, of where deforestation had happened. And that got me really interested in satellite data. Satellite scenes were expensive and difficult to access back then. You had to request them from NASA and you got a DVD back in the post, which seems crazy in these days of Google Earth and instant access to data.
Yeah, but remember, that was also like the Netflix model, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You got DVDs in the mail. So.
Yeah, no, that was the world.
Ourselves, but that's the reality.
I mean, when satellite data started being released, it wasn't like internet access was sufficiently good to easily download it and do things with it anyway. So I guess maybe that was the easiest way to do it. But yeah, it got me interested in looking at satellite data and making better maps of deforestation and reforestation and where that was happening around the world to help engage conservation effectively. So I went to do a PhD at the University of Edinburgh and spent quite a lot of time doing field work in particularly Central Africa, Cameroon and Uganda, measured 10,000 trees or something over a few years in different sites, and spent 6 months at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, working with Sasan Saatchi there, who's now CEO of Seatrees, a different company doing nature mapping, but learning how to use different types of satellite data, especially radar satellite data, which is satellites that can see straight through clouds and see what's going on in the forests. I then worked for a startup that was doing forest conservation projects, carbon finance projects called Global Green Carbon, based out of California. So I worked for them for a couple of years. I guess interesting themes that come up in this podcast. They were trying to do reforestation in Nicaragua, really cool project, growing cocoa trees in farmers' lands that were typically slash and burn. But their business model needed a carbon price of $30 or $40 a ton. And back in 2010, just after the Copenhagen Climate Conference, you were lucky to get $5 a ton.
Yeah.
So it just didn't happen, and these projects didn't work. So I went back to academia, became a lecturer, then eventually a professor at the University of Edinburgh, wrote a lot of peer-reviewed papers on how to combine different types of satellite data. It was a period where things had turned. There was this deluge of satellite data sets, particularly from European Space Agency as well as NASA. And we didn't know what to do with it. I guess we'd now call it AI. Back then it was kind of machine learning and big data, and how to combine these different data sets to get rid of the noise and make good maps of forest carbon and land cover. And we had some great successes, wrote some good papers about how to map the world's biomass and deforestation. Forest degradation was something I'm particularly interested in, which we found to be really quite widespread compared to deforestation, but very poorly mapped. But I started Space Intelligence in 2018 because we were really feeling quite disconnected from the actual problem. So my colleague at the university there, Murray Collins, and I started the company to get closer to projects so we could actually serve maps to NGOs and private companies that were starting forest conservation projects. We started 2020 with one employee. It was just Murray, me, and one of my ex-PhD students. And I don't know if the pandemic really helped us, or by kind of leveling the playing field, making sure everyone had to stay at home and do Zoom calls, or just the market took off. But we had a lot of success in 2020 selling maps to various different groups of people. So we ended up growing rapidly, and we're almost 40 people today. And Murray and I have both left our university jobs to run the company.
Funnily, I just met up with Murray this morning, actually. Just so he's here in Singapore.
That's a great stories. And I think it really speaks to kind of the founding story of space intelligence, right? And that kind of trajectory. And that brings us to where you are today with space intelligence. And, Verra selected you as one of just 3 data service providers for the jurisdictional baselines under VM0048. And, you're powering due diligence for the Symbiosis Coalition. So I want to transition and talk about that and what that actually means for the market. Space Intelligence provides the geospatial due diligence for the Symbiosis Coalition. But I think that raises a good question, like why are sophisticated corporates, forming coalitions and running RFPs instead of just buying credits on the spot market, right? Like it's sort of creates that, that question. So I think we'll start there.
Yeah, do you want to take this?
Yes. So at Space Intelligence, we just produce really high quality maps of land cover and forest carbon storage, which can be used by many different types of actors in the market. Project developers can use them to actually develop the data they need to go through verification and get carbon credits. Buyers can use them for due diligence. Carbon standards can use them to set up baselines that apply for multiple projects. And we get used outside the carbon markets as well, around things like supply chains, checking for zero deforestation in coffee or cocoa, for example. In all cases, it's providing high quality maps to these projects. But the reason these coalitions pop up is that there just aren't enough high quality projects that meet the specific requirements of these sets of buyers. These projects don't exist. And the main reason for that, in my view, is the lack of early stage financing for a forest project. I guess I've done it. I said I've been involved in trying to make these projects happen, and particularly in the reforestation side, these ARR projects. It's a very long journey. Like you need to find a set of engaged communities and a piece of land where it's a good place to plant trees. You need to engage local government, find out all your carbon standard work with the communities and come up with a plan, and then secure the funding to set up nurseries, plant the trees, actually make the project go, let the trees grow a few years, and then eventually you might be able to do the paperwork to claim a carbon credit. That process might take 7 or 8 years of very capital intensive work. And there's no way someone's going to lend you the money for that unless you have a clear signal that someone's going to buy those credits at the end of it. There was another way that we kind of could have done the carbon markets around ex-ante credits, where people sold the credits up front and used that money to plant the trees. I was quite involved in the Plan Vivo Foundation, a carbon standard out of Edinburgh that did pioneer that working with smallholders, and it worked quite well. The decisions of the UNFCCC in other ways means we're not doing ex-ante carbon credits. That just doesn't exist. It's all ex post. It's after the fact, proving that you've already sequestered this carbon or stopped this carbon being emitted and then claiming the carbon. That just means there's this very long time period before you start getting real carbon revenue. And that means there has to be clear early stage financing and clear signals over the long term that people are going to buy these credits if you set up a high quality project meeting their requirements. So yeah, we do due diligence for people directly. So people like Apple use us to do due diligence for their reforestation projects. And then through the Symbiosis Coalition, again, we do the advanced due diligence where we're looking at sites and making sure they meet all the requirements of the methodologies that these projects want to follow, but also the requirements of the people who have committed to the Symbiosis Coalition, these big tech companies, that they meet their requirements in terms of things like durability. So making sure this is going to be a sensible site to grow trees in 50 or 100 years' time, rather than just today, in terms of fire risk and deforestation history and various kind of super strict requirements to make sure it's really somewhere they're going to be wanting to source carbon credits from over the coming decades.
Yeah. Rene, did you want to?
Happy to also just jump on that. In addition to obviously the necessary demand signal to be ultimately received by the market proponents, like you said, Ed, right? These projects take a long time in terms of the development cycle, but it's also has to do with the actual, it actually has to do with the extensive due diligence that's required, right, by a lot of these buyers, and some of them have the capacity to do that in house, right, and have developed that and have developed the human, like brain trust and manpower to actually do this. But the reason why these coalitions are popping up are really to ultimately centralize that function through a secretariat. And ultimately, the corporate's role is to select from the best projects that have gone through that full due diligence process and come out on the other side and select which projects are best suited for their own purposes and structure those portfolios. Now, once they have that offtake in place, the project developers can go out there and seek the financing that's necessary, typically, because most project developers aren't coming in at this with really strong balance sheets, like you said, right? It's they're not able to secure debt financing because there's nothing to securitize against. Right, and there's not a liquid market where other folks can try to hedge. So ultimately, it comes down to the financing, which kind of brings me into the recent announcement of the ARC coalition that was just announced last week through Ecosperity in Singapore. And we're not affiliated in any way, but we were sort of had a front row seat to this because last year's Ecosperity, the core group that ultimately had led to this successful announcement, were really working this idea around at the conference. We helped to recommend a corporate buyer to sign up, and they did, and we're really glad that that's the case. It sends a really strong signal to the market of at least 10 million tons of demand, potentially even higher. But you've got a really great mix of different buyers. So the Symbiosis Coalition, there was a concentration of a lot of the tech US-centric, mega caps. And in this case, it's an Asian-centric, but also global view. And so you've got folks like Tencent, who obviously led the coalition. You've got Mitsubishi, CATL, Osaka Gas, Vale, Rubicon Carbon, a number of others who come in together to ultimately to drive this sort of nascent demand quotient here in Asia. And I think that's also reflective of the welcoming environment that the Singapore government and Gen Zero and others have created for this to ultimately develop. It'll be really interesting to see how that coalition ultimately learns from the lessons of the previous coalition. So I'm thinking folks like Frontier and Symbiosis, and ultimately then can operationalize the lessons like the space intelligence expertise in that advanced due diligence. I know that you work also with Abatable on the Symbiosis side as well, in sort of the procurement piece. And I think that's the next part. And I think that we'll see more and more Eddie. Sorry, we've got two Eds. Eddie, I think we'll see more advanced market coalitions starting to form in and around clusters, whether geographically or around specific asset classes or subsets of different projects. Just some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Rene. And I think now I want to touch on a few more aspects here before we move on. for our audience, a lot of people conflate the terms durability and permanence. And for some listeners who might conflate those terms, I would love for you to tell us, what the distinction is, and why does it matter for how we evaluate carbon credits, right? And how space intelligence, tackles those two areas.
Yeah, I mean, I just hate the term permanence, really, because what is permanent? This planet's going to disappear in a few billion years. Certainly, most of our rocks are weathered and recycled. So even if you took CO2 and turned it into solid carbon, there's no way it's permanently staying there. So I prefer the term durability, which I think is helpful. It gets the idea of how long this carbon you've locked up in the atmosphere should stay out of the atmosphere. And clearly, there are more and less durable project types. It's one of the aspects that we encourage people to consider. So yeah, we have a tool that looks at different aspects of durability, focusing on climate risk. So that's things like hurricanes and fires and floods, and then looking at people risks. So things related to the pressure of deforestation on a site. Clearly, if you're planting new trees in an area where all the existing trees have been cut down, there might be an increased likelihood that your own trees might get cut down over the coming years compared to a very forested area or an area with few people. Other risks we look at as well in this aspect. This does vary quite a lot for natural projects. Again, the thing I try and stress to people when we show them these tools is this isn't the risk to the actual tree. Trees are not durable in the really long term because trees die, they have a lifespan, they're living organisms, their wood might get locked up into a piece of furniture or a building, but again, in time that will degrade. But forests can be not permanent, but they can exist there for hundreds or thousands of years. And what you really want is to create projects that have a good case and a good reason why this area will stay forested in the long term. And even if there are risks related to things like fires or hurricanes, showing that this is the kind of area where trees will come back in that site without need for much human intervention. So what we've built for Symbiosis, and we hope to use for other people, is a durability tool that helps look at the risks so they can find out for a site whether this is high, low, or medium risk, these various different aspects, and use that to compare between projects and also look at their mitigation plan. Like if an area is at a high risk of fire, then that doesn't necessarily mean you don't invest in that site, but you make sure that fire risk management is included in the developer's plans. They're going to put up fire breaks, train people in firefighting skills locally, and set that up for the long term. It's that kind of work.
Yeah. And I also wanted to touch on how, I find it very interesting. Like one of the biggest costs of building high integrity carbon projects, or even buying high integrity credits, is the due diligence, right? And every company. So a lot of these, let's say US tech companies, for example, which have been the largest participants in the primary market, structuring very large long-term offtakes.
Can I counter that? They are large, definitely, but the largest are actually the oil and gas folks. Let's not forget, Shell's the largest buyer in the market by a long shot. Previously, it was the airlines, right? Like Delta was the largest buyer, buying at 1.30 million tons. But Shell at the last check, I think it was 16 million tons. But definitely the tech buyers have the sophistication. But I just want to chime in there.
All right. Well,
we shouldn't forget
right about that. But I'm just trying to say, like these companies building in-house expertise to assess projects, right? Like Microsoft, for example. And do you think that the coalition model solves that by amortizing diligence costs across members, right? And allocating that to space intelligence, for example, like that. So companies don't have to go out and build this internal team themselves when it's not really a part of their core business model, right? Like the economics of this coalition model just make better sense for corporates.
They do. There's no point all of these individual companies developing really good due diligence in-house, and how can they really know whether that's kind of world-leading due diligence? It's tricky when you're doing things in-house to benchmark against others. So doing it in a coalition makes sense. Much as I'd love individually each of these key companies to engage us to do due diligence on the same projects, it makes far more commercial sense for us to do that in a centralized way through these coalitions. But also for a buyer, it makes sense to buy a portion of the credits from a large number of projects rather than putting all your eggs in one basket. These coalitions make sense because they form a risk pooling or hedging for this coalition of buyers. That's the sensible way to do it. And again, if we had a more mature market, you could do that by just purchasing carbon credits at spot, so buying from a large number of projects that met your quality criteria. But we don't have that. A lot of these coalitions are focusing a lot on reforestation projects, and there just isn't a deep pool of those credits. So if that's what you want to do, you want to be funding restoration, which it's a perfectly fair thing to do, but you're going to have to put a lot of signal and money in now to allow those projects to expand and flourish that meet your requirements. And that's what's pushing towards these coalitions, I think.
Yeah. I love that word, Eddie, right? Amortization, because it's exactly the right word for this. It means that you can actually have inclusion of not just the big titans, right? Not there's just the huge companies with really strong balance sheets and relatively low carbon footprints like the tech companies, but you can actually now provide that leverage for either large emitters or other companies that have been sitting on the sidelines that just have had this barrier of entry to come in. So that's the first thing that's a really good point around the amortization. And then Ed, sorry, we've got Eddie and Ed. So Ed Mitchard and Eddie Smith. So Ed, on your point around the buyer coalitions having certain preferences, certainly the Symbiosis Coalition has got a preference for the removals across, afforestation, reforestation, and now blue carbon P that they've got going. The interesting about the ARC Coalition, I don't know if this has been published, so apologies to guys if I've kind of let the cat out of the bag, but it's a more broad sort of view around, agnostic around the geography and necessarily the project type. What they're looking for is just highest, institutional grade quality. That's that point. And then the other interesting bit is we're kind of coming back to what we talked about before around the financing bit. Typically, the advanced market coalitions have just been the buyer pool and then the centralization of that secretariat function for the due diligence. The R coalition is different because it's also got adjacent to or sitting on top of it a financing facility as well. And so the Carbon Growth Partner guys led by Rich Gilmore are going to basically provide that financing component. And then you've got Temasek Trust coming in also on the financing, but for grants and for early stage opportunities. So essentially, the R coalition is really intelligently constructed because it can ingest early stage opportunities, sort of, adolescent, let's say, opportunities like middle stage, and then also late stage potentially as well, subject to the quality criteria. And then they can evaluate those projects, hopefully at scale, and then ultimately come out the other side. And then you've got a really strong contingent of buyers. And the other thing that I understand is that this is not the final group of buyers, that it is open for more and more buyers to come in, either into this coalition or to form other coalitions under this sort of umbrella. So just some pretty interesting kind of diversification approaches.
Yeah, I think, sorry, Ed, did you want to say something or?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's been really smartly put together. As you say, it's no surprise to me at all. It's coming out of Singapore. We've seen so much happening, like real customer interest from Singapore over the last 24 months or so. The government decides to do something there. They don't do it by halves. And it's great that they're catalyzing a whole ecosystem in that area. And if that coalition is open to growing, I can see that having a real impact on, the amount of trees in Southeast Asia, which is great.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I think the coalition model is great. And it's very interesting because it's agnostic to whether you're buying, we'll get into this, and this is a good transition into the next topic, but I think it's agnostic to whether you're buying removal or avoidance credits, maybe not as much with Symbiosis as they focus on removals, but I think it's about quality at the end of the day, not so much for the category, which kind of brings us to a debate that's shaped a lot of buyer behavior over the past few years. The market has increasingly bifurcated into removal credits, and some corporate buyers have signaled a strong preference for removals over avoidance, citing kind of lower integrity, right? But I think, Ed, you have a different view, and we've spoken about this before, but it'd be great to get kind of your angle on this from an expert in the field, and kind of your story about how the math on climate impact tells a different story, right?
Yeah, I'd love to. I probably unwisely get involved in the chat sections of LinkedIn posts too often around this, but it's definitely something I feel passionately about. And firstly, there's tons of room in the world for removals credits, like planting trees where we've cut down trees, or all the other aspects of nature restoration. That's a great thing. It's something we should do. By its nature, it's expensive. It's much harder to restore an area than to avoid deforestation or other changes. But it's something we should do. And buyers are buying something. They have the right to just pay more for something if they want to. But taking a step back, I'm a carbon scientist with a satellite imaging bent fundamentally, and we can see what's happening in the world. So my whole life, there's been about 1% of tropical forest lost every year. That's 40% of tropical forests gone over my lifetime. That 1% a year is carrying on. That hasn't slowed in the 2020s. There was a small blip in 2020 related to COVID, and then 2021 marched straight back up again to make up for lost time as people with the chainsaws got going again. So that deforestation has carried on, and it's about 15 to 20% of the anthropogenic emissions we're producing each year is related to largely tropical deforestation. So we have to deal with the fossil fuels bit, that 80%. Clearly that has to go down to near zero over the coming decades. That's a massive challenge, and that's something we're working on and we need to accelerate on. Pin that, but that's definitely happening. But the 20% related to land use change, we should have stopped that by now. We've known that was a problem since the 80s. We should stop it even regardless of carbon, right? But destroying these forests that cool local temperatures, a massive store of biodiversity that stabilize coastlines and stabilize hillsides. Like, it's just a sensible thing to do. We've already cleared so much of the earth. Like, we have enough land to do all the agriculture we need to feed many more billions of people than we have right now. And so it seems to me that the obvious thing in this transition, where we currently can't produce a car with zero emissions, we can't do a lot of things with zero emissions, we should be encouraging companies to buy carbon offsets and using that money to largely stop deforestation and to restore and to do other things as we have the funds to do it. But that should be where the majority of the carbon credits are produced, is from REDD, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation projects. I think it's tragic that kind of over the past decade or so, these projects have existed and been able to sell credits due to integrity concerns. It's kind of the market's died down again and up and down. These are long-term projects that makes it so hard on the ground that you need to go and talk to communities and work for perhaps a decade to get a REDD project going, but it can disappear in a year. And it's really hard if a project developer goes bust and leaves an area to go back and try and re-engage those communities. That's going to be a very hard conversation. Yeah, I think we urgently need to make up for lost time and do everything all at once. I'm not saying we should just do REDD projects by any means. We should do all the categories that we can of trying to remove and avoid carbon going to the atmosphere. But it's the biggest category in the 20s right now. While there's real deforestation risk, we should be using money that could be willingly given to stop it.
I think, that stat is insane, right? Like 40% of tropical forests gone in your lifetime. And now, so I want to just quickly touch on that. Is that primarily because of, let's say, like logging and the timber commodity market? And also with satellite imagery, like now, I'd say compared to 40 years ago, now I would assume that you're able to identify like much more accurately the areas where it's happening the most than now versus in the past, right? So could you maybe touch on like maybe just the quick facts and kind of statistics on tropical deforestation and the current landscape of that?
Yeah, sure. I'll just caveat my figure slightly. Deforestation and severe degradation. And obviously there's regrowth that happens naturally as well. So there isn't 40% less forest in the tropics than there was 40 years ago. Yeah, it's been a massive decrease in primary forest over that period. It's not really driven by logging. The logging in the tropics is selective logging normally. So you take out one tree per hectare or two trees per hectare. Hectare's 100 by 100 meters. You're leaving the other 798 trees there. Maybe you damage some of them as the tree falls over. That logging does cause damage to the forests, but the main way it causes deforestation is it often opens roads into the forest, and that allows agriculturalists to come in. So deforestation is largely caused by clearing for agriculture. Often that's mostly driven by capital from the West. So people clearing large areas of land to grow palm oil in Southeast Asia largely, or soybeans and cattle in Brazil, mixture of things in Africa. There is some deforestation caused by slash and burn agriculturalists as populations grow, particularly in places like Africa. There is some clearance of forest for charcoal or to make room for areas for agriculture. But yeah, it's largely industrialized agriculture. People who can afford bulldozers are the people who make the biggest difference to forest areas. And it's kind of unfair because they're the biggest countries, Rene. But yeah, the kind of area of deforestation is dominated by Brazil and Indonesia. It's the countries that have lost the most.
Yeah, thank you for sharing the facts and figures. Rene, did you want to jump in here?
So I want to reflect back on kind of your original sort of introduction there, Eddie. This false binary, that was actually the core theme of the conference at Ecosperity. And so I actually sat down with Fred Teo, the CEO of Gen Zero, ahead of the conference, and we ended up publishing his episode. So if anyone's interested in kind of diving into Fred's thoughts, really great summary in terms of we don't need these false binaries, right? It shouldn't be either or. It should be an and. We have a very finite carbon budget, and Ed, thanks for giving us some context there around the urgency there around not just the deforestation but the degradation and just the emissions that are coming from land use. It is so significant, but it's ultimately they're representative of our carbon sinks. Once we erode those or degrade those, like it's really significant in terms of the climatic tipping points, etc. So we've got an obligation to protect the existing forests that we have, and then try to recover as many of the lost ones, and try to sequester as much carbon as possible. Right. At the same time, we've also got to wean ourselves off the hydrocarbons and stop burning stuff. I think I sat down with Rich Gilmore, and he always sort of summarized it really well. He's just like, we've got to stop burning stuff and cutting down trees. Like that's the solution to the climate, right? So coming back to this false narrative, like we don't need to have avoidance versus removals. We don't need to have REDD versus ARR. We don't need to have DAC versus nature. We need to do all at once, and we need to do them, and it's going to be dependent on going up the marginal abatement cost curve, like you said, Ed. Right? Some of the removals that are either more difficult to just more expensive actually to implement, right? Talk about nurseries, talk about tree planting, etc. More costly than protecting the existing forest. But then also look at things like enhanced rock weathering and direct air capture and other more technological type of processes. They're far more cost intensive, right? So the unit economics just don't stack up. So they have to seek this premium. It comes back to your earlier experience, at the project developer. I think what was the name? Sorry, it was Green Gold
Carbon.
Yeah,
Global Green Carbon. I'll try and get them right.
And so if the unit economics don't work, then those businesses don't stand up, and we don't see those actions. But ultimately, right now we've got a choice of a lot of different opportunities on the board, and companies that are stepping up and supporting them should be rewarded. But we should also encourage companies to look more broadly, to ultimately think about it not just from an integrity perspective, because that's key, but also look at it from the timing perspective. A lot of the nature removals are backdated, right? Like they're going to start to yield supply in years 8 and beyond, and ultimately they need to have high quality credits coming in now, and there's quite a lot of really high integrity credits that are out there when you do look at it, right? Whether that's methane, like the super pollutants, and even now on the REDD side, are we starting to see the emergence of the new methodologies, jurisdictional baselines, etc. And so the story needs to be, hey, we need the participation to help to underwrite these activities, because without them, we're not standing any chance of channeling finance to ultimately addressing these issues.
I think people seem to have No, I agree. People seem to have this feeling that there's a lower integrity for avoidance credits, because it's like, how did you know that you weren't going to do it? But they have advantages that you can issue them immediately, like from year one of your project, whether that's avoiding methane leaks from a pipeline or stopping you cutting down forests. You've immediately got the benefit that greenhouse gas doesn't go to the atmosphere, and that's a great thing. I think people somehow conceptually just think that that's less real compared to a counterfactual than a reforestation credit. But in both cases,
there's a time
you have
value
this
of carbon.
counterfactual. There is.
But there's a time value of carbon concept that doesn't really get discussed oftentimes, right? But like you said, if we don't avoid those emissions and they go into the atmosphere today, well, they're heating the planet today, and that's going to compound in the atmosphere a long period of time. So we may or may not come through with these solutions, because there's still a lot of risks involved with these projects, that, to remove those tons in the future. But that's like the reason why we don't have ex-ante projects is the same reason why we need to not have that all our eggs in that one basket. So we need to have that diversification as part of the overall math, right? Because the math ain't math.
There's a funny thing with the price signal here as well. Like people see removals credits as often far more expensive than avoidance credits, and they think along, I don't know, price of a bottle of wine or something. It's got to be better.
It's unit economics.
More expensive.
It's unit economics.
Yeah, exactly. It's like ton of carbon is a ton of carbon, and you want to, presuming you have $1,000 to spend, you want to spend that to take as much carbon out of the atmosphere as you can, rather than buy the premium product. It's fewer tons.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think, some of the integrity concerns, right, that drive buyers toward removals are real. Inflated baselines and older REDD Plus methodologies did undermine trust, but the standards have evolved dramatically, right? So I want to talk about how digital MRV is catching up with, how MRV is catching up with technology, kind of transitioning to DMRV. So for listeners who haven't tracked the methodology evolution, Now, what was wrong with the old approach to setting REDD plus baselines, and how do VM48's jurisdictional risk maps fix it? Curious.
Yeah, very happy to talk about that. In general, I guess there can be high and low integrity projects of all types. I guess the quality needs to be orthogonal to the type. There's no fundamental reason why a removals credit is better as higher integrity than an avoidance one. But there were a large number of avoidance credits from REDD in the first generation of the carbon market in the 20s, where we were still working out how to predict these counterfactuals, things we did that maybe in retrospect wasn't the wisest, as we gave project developers a lot of choice. So lots of different people popped up, produced these methodologies, and project developer developing a REDD project could choose between methodology A, B, or C. And then even within those methodologies, they had choices of ways of making a baseline. And it's impossible to predict the future, right? We don't know what future deforestation would be in any of these sites, but people were incentivized to choose the methods that produce the most aggressive baselines. And you can't really blame a project developer for doing that. They were following the rules. They're often sitting in this site, seeing the deforestation in the landscape. It feels very real to them in a way it maybe doesn't look to someone just looking at a map and seeing the kind of red splodges as the deforestation happens around them. But they ended up choosing fairly aggressive baselines, and it's been shown that in some cases, when you actually look ex post back at these projects, they probably issued too many credits because they had these baselines that were too aggressive. I don't think it's anything like as bad as some papers have pushed. There's some fundamental errors in the way this analysis is often done ex post, and people often don't fully recognize the uncertainties of the analyses. You don't know what would have happened to a site. REDD projects are often put in a particular place for a very particular reason. This bit of forest is unique and at threat, and trying to compare it to other bits of forest that seem similar but might be thousands of kilometers away with very different pressures. They may not be good kind of counterfactuals to what would have happened in that site without the project. But nonetheless, like long before these kind of scandals and this Guardian article in 2023 that criticized a lot of these projects came out, we were already working on a next generation of methodologies that took into account the ways in which forest risk should be mapped. This was called the Consolidated REDD methodology. I first got involved in it in 2020 through Space Intelligence. We were involved in some pilot projects and maps. It's become what's been called, in a very catchy way, VM48. It's a Verra methodology about setting baselines, and this applies to all Verra REDD projects now. So what they have to do is, rather than the project developer getting to choose from this menu of different baselines, they take a baseline that's already given to them by Verra, which says this is the risk of deforestation to your project site over the coming years. And those risk maps and the fundamental remote sensing data, satellite data analysis behind that are produced by companies like Space Intelligence. So I think we've done these for 8 countries now, and we're, as you mentioned earlier, Rene, we're one of 3 companies that are going to carry on doing these for the next 5 years. So this takes choice away from the project developer and means they can be done in a very rigorous, quite conservative way across whole countries. So as you gradually piece together more and more REDD projects within a country, they'll all have consistent baselines and they'll all issue credits that have high integrity from the baseline point of view. And if they don't stop deforestation compared to that baseline, they won't be issued any credits. It's very clear. You have to take this conservative baseline and then monitor your actual success against that project and see how you do. There are other methodologies. So Equitable Earth has released their MO02, but that works in quite a similar way. Again, it has these risk maps that project developers pay money to receive rather than setting their own. And that's clearly the way the market is going.
Yeah, thanks for that background. A couple of points of reflection. So I interviewed Patrick Greenfield from on the Carbon Exposure podcast. I've actually interviewed him for a second time, and that episode comes out next week. So stay tuned for anyone that's interested. But there was certainly these criticisms around the overcrediting and highlighting that overcrediting risk were warranted. To your point, however, there's still this argument, and look, it's kind of a redundant argument around, like you said, right? Like they've overestimated and sensationalized the kind of these issues. But for what it's worth, now the market was already moving in this direction to ultimately self-regulate and improve, and now it's taken a very, very long time because of the scrutiny, has now got this path forward. I think we need to look at it and celebrate that is now the case. It's very difficult, as you said, operating in this world of counterfactuals. But one of the unintended consequences, I think, that's happened from this, whether unintended or intended, I'll take the glass half full type of approach, is that because it's created so much kind of conflation here, it's led to a buyer withdrawal from the market itself. And to your point, the pre-existing projects that have been doing really great work have found it incredibly difficult from a cash flow perspective. And once their offtakes ended, very few of them were able to structure new offtakes. It's only a handful of really high quality projects, and many others are really doing it tough. And so Patrick wrote a second article which kind of touched on this, right? Like what happens when the climate finance runs out, but didn't really recognize the causality of how the criticisms have ultimately led to this. And so now the question coming to you is like, how does that perversity pan out in the real world? Like ultimately your clients are these projects and ultimately these communities that are ingesting this data set. How are you seeing, the deforestation impact? Is it growing, like in where there were projects over time, and then maybe these projects have fallen over, or what are you seeing, in those jurisdictions? Like, I don't imagine deforestation's decreased at all, right? I imagine it's only going to increase, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's tragic the impact that's happened, and I'm sure it wasn't intentional, but there's no alternative source of funding for these avoided deforestation projects, right? And no one was arguing there were high rates of deforestation within these REDD projects. Like, everyone agrees they were effective. Like, deforestation largely stopped within these boundaries. The questions are all about how much deforestation would have happened in the absence of the project and whether that had been overstated. But these were effective conservation projects. I don't know if there's been any formal analysis done on them. I think about 25 of these projects are really studied in detail, some detail by these analyses, but there were 120 odd REDD projects that have been affected by this backlash, and many of them are no longer operational, and deforestation rates have certainly increased within those project boundaries. Some have managed to keep going, and some will successfully transition over to other methodologies and keep operating, I hope. That's great to people who've stepped in and provided that funding. But yeah, the overall impact of the scandal around REDD has surely been to increase the deforestation rate across these high-risk areas of the tropics. I just hope there's a second wave of projects that comes on board as these risk maps are produced. People can look at the hotspots, set up new projects, or refund old ones, and hopefully, I guess it'd be wonderful over the next couple of years that can really take off, and there can be this funding for protecting forests from loss and bringing this money back to communities in these areas to explore alternative livelihoods or benefit from being stewards of their forests for the rest of the world.
Yeah. And to that point, I completely agree. I hope that that's the case. I had this conversation with Amy Merrill on the sidelines of Ecosperity. I also interviewed her for the other podcast. I'm not trying to plug, but we've queued up a whole bunch of really interesting conversations. But like that point around, okay, the market received the feedback. We need to improve and tighten the methodologies and ultimately drive towards a higher integrity bar. Great. Now that that's done, is the market going to come back? Like, because there's a lot of corporates that essentially use this as an excuse, right? Or ultimately just delayed participation in the market. But now that these things have been resolved and these projects are starting to yield supply, are they going to come back in? And that's what we need to see, right? Because we need to call out that perversity. Because saying that that the market wasn't sufficient integrity and we'll wait until that's the case. Well, now that that's the case, we need to ultimately see that, because, like you said, there's no other better mechanism to ultimately channel the finance to address these and these missions. And also on the other side, like, most corporates aren't actually bending the curve in terms of their emissions. So we need to call it what it is.
Yeah, it needs to become a reputational risk for a big emitter, a big company, not to be offsetting. Whereas currently, I think you talk to the sustainability department and they're like, well, it's a real risk to go and buy REDD credits. Like, we can just do nothing and we're fine. If we start buying these credits, and we're going to put ourselves into potential getting on the front page of a paper, we just don't want to go that. So I guess space intelligence comes in a bit here. We try to offer data sets to convince companies, at least internally and externally, that they're only buying credits from high quality projects. Yeah, certainly the REDD projects we supported previously, they're not ones that have been caught up in this, in that they've been caught up in the wider storm, but they didn't overissue credits. That's good. But I don't know if we can persuade enough corporates to take that jump now. As you say, if they start doing it in 2031, we'll have lost another big chunk of rainforest. have a hotter atmosphere and harder world to grow trees in, all this kind of thing. That the action needs to happen ideally 20 years ago. We'll take it this year if we can. But yeah, we can't delay this by more years. I'm quite hopeful for the SBTI guidelines coming out soon. Will increasingly push towards seeing a positive role for offsets as part of the green transition these companies that have signed up are going for. I think that's a possible source of growth alongside Corsair as well. Big demand. I hope a lot of that goes into forest conservation, whether that's jurisdictional or ideally trickling down to some of these projects.
Of course, here's a tricky one. Let's leave that to another conversation. But the SBTI one,
indeed.
Do you want to unpack some of that? And Eddie, I know you wanted to discuss that as well, so we don't want to deviate too much from your run sheet.
No, it's all right. Yeah, I mean, look, I want to be cautious of Ed's time, so let us know. But we could talk about SBTI and how like their beyond value chain mitigation framework like suggests that companies should shift toward removals over time. Does that framing make sense to you, or does it risk underfunding forest protection?
No, it makes sense to me, to be honest. I think that is, I don't know, the world is committed to end deforestation many times. Most recently, I think it said it would end by 2020 under what's that, Sustainable Development Goals said deforestation will stop by 2020. As other commitments by 2030. We'll see if that happens. At some point, we may get to a point where many countries have effectively stopped deforestation. It does tend to happen as countries get more developed anyway. The countries like UK, US had a lot of deforestation as they developed, and then as they get richer, forests start to come back. That seems to have happened in China now, which had a high rate of deforestation, but now is net gaining forest each year. So maybe if we help some of these countries that still have high rates of deforestation through that kind of forest transition, there could be much less pressure on forests in 2035, 2040. That would be a great thing. I hope the REDD projects will still exist and still be helping communities, but the availability of cheap avoidance credits should reduce across the economy over the coming decades. So that switch through time, through to removals makes perfect sense. And that's consistent with the models we have in IPCC of how we fight climate change. That's what they say as we mobilize every dollar we can for avoidance. That's the same kind of thing stopping deforestation as switching off coal power stations and moving to renewables. It's exactly the same theory. And then in time, we start sucking out the extra carbon where we can. I'm supportive of that. I guess SBTI is a science-based targets initiative. It's a voluntary thing that various corporates have signed up to. It's had a really good uptake. In general, they really try and push towards companies reducing their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions directly as much as they can, rather than relying on offsets. There were some pretty fundamental views on that by many members of the committees. But increasingly, they are aligning to allow some offset use. For example, particularly around a percentage of scope 3 emissions. And I guess if I was writing it, I might have a slightly bigger role for offsets, at least in the 2020s, where many companies just have no easy route to decarbonizing. But I can see overall why it's been set up that way, and it seems like a positive nudge for these corporates.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree with you more, and it's a very touchy topic. Seems to be in the market, but I want to hit on a last question. You've obviously seen the market evolve from needing $30 a ton in 2010 to where we are today. From a forward-looking perspective, what are you most optimistic about within the carbon markets? Pretty broad question, but curious to hear your thoughts.
I am fundamentally an optimist. I guess that's why I jumped out of a stable job in a university to start a company. I guess one of the things that's really transformed over the last decades is the availability of really high quality, free operational satellite data. So particularly the European Union and the UK have funded something called the Copernicus Coalition, which produces 10-meter resolution optical and radar satellite data, which is perfect for making maps of land cover and land cover change, deforestation, degradation across the world. And that data is free and open. That doesn't make it trivial to use because you need to have algorithms that can deal with terabytes of data. But that's really what underpins what we do at Space Intelligence, is being able to access that data and make it into intelligence that can be used by projects. The fact that data exists for free should enable digital monitoring, reporting, and verification systems to be used throughout thousands, tens of thousands of projects throughout the world, where we're doing all kinds of good things for nature and getting credit for it. I'm a strong believer that you can't make anything happen in the world if you can't measure it. So no one's going to finance a project if they can't easily go on a screen and see year on year the trees growing, or see that an area that's meant to be protected has stayed protected. And I guess that's the bit of the glue in the market we're trying to produce. And I'm confident over the coming years that can make the dominoes fall for a real flow of billions of dollars into the tropics to stop deforestation and fund restoration. I suspect I'm too optimistic about how quickly that will happen. I'm certain it could happen over 12 to 24 months. The tropics could take a big investment, generalizing a lot, but labor and land are cheap in the tropics. You can make a big difference for your dollars compared to what you can do in Europe or North America, and let alone Singapore. So I hope we can mobilize that capital to make a difference to the tropics. But yeah, I think the fact that space agencies have invested in these satellites that produce the data that help us do MRV is a fantastic thing.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ed. This has been an invaluable conversation. Did you have something to say before we close it out?
No, that was great. I really enjoyed this conversation. Like I said to you from the outset, Ed, like we're curious and we want to learn. And obviously, I was actually just chatting with Murray in the background, and I just told him how excited I was to get you on the show. And yeah, look, no, a really, really interesting conversation. It's such a dynamic space, right? But to your point, like there aren't any other better solutions that can actually deliver on the results, right? And in a credible and verifiable format. So we've created all of this rigor in our ecosystem to ultimately count for the carbon credits, but we now need to start to see that finance to start to flow. And whether it's distributed signals through compliance markets or it's voluntary participation re-engaging into this market, we need that participation to help to underwrite this flow, because otherwise we're just going to be just witnesses to this climate like catastrophe that we're careening towards. I'm also an optimist, but this morning I had to reflect pretty sort of serious the reality of the current weather patterns that are shaping up towards having serious climatic events with a super El Nino that's kind of being predicted for this year, that coupled with the Strait of Hormuz constraints on fertilizers could lead to pretty significant impact in terms of calories for a lot of people globally, and that doesn't sit right. And we've, like you said, we've known about this for a very long time. And yeah, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. And the next best time is today. I think we need to abide by that old adage and that wisdom and try to do that now in this market.
No, I totally agree, Rene. I mean, we're basking in the sunshine here in the UK. We just had the hottest day in May ever on records. And no one seems to be talking about climate change and thinking about that as the direct cause of these temperatures. And while it might be nice being in the sunshine, I'm sure this could come with droughts and problems in the UK and problems in the wider world. And yeah, we have to act on this.
Yeah, I'll contrast that with and this is just anecdotal again, right? And weather tends to lead to that anecdotal kind of evidence. But the carbon exposure team, which I also lead, just came back from a project site visit in North India in Rajasthan. They went to see the Verra team, and it was 45 degrees in May. Right. And now we're not even into the hottest part of the year. So there's people that are going to experience extreme heat this year across not just Asia, but certainly the Middle East, which is always the case, but certain parts of North Africa and other parts of the world. And that's significant. And I think we just can't keep kicking this can down the road. But we need to ultimately start to address and reverse the worst effects of climate change. And the time for all the talking and the finger pointing is over. We just got to engage.
Yeah, I can't imagine planting a tree in that heat. And we need the trees there because they provide local cooling as well and shade. Mm-hmm. That's going to be even more vital in our cities and landscapes over the coming decades, which will inevitably be warmer than the last set.
Exactly. Good. Ed, thanks so much. Really enjoyed the conversation. Yeah. Eddie, great moderating again.
Thanks
you.
Again.
Pleasure all mine. Lovely to meet you both.
Thank you.
Okay, cheers.
Bye.